Okay, Gerhard on the call process and visitation. The sixth volume of Gerhard's Lotzi Theologici, his Theological Commonplaces, containing the commonplaces on the ecclesiastical ministry and on political magistracy, was first printed in 1619. The years leading up to 1619 were Gerhard's first years as a professor of theology at Jena, yet he had been active in the pastoral ministry for 10 years before he came to Jena in 1616. On June 5th, 1606, he was called to be pastor and superintendent of Heldburg by Duke Johann Casimir of Coburg. 4 years later, in December 1610, Gerhard had made his report of an inspection of the churches and schools of Heldburg and had come to conclusions about how they needed to be improved. Having successfully carried out this task, he was given the duty of conducting a general inspection of all of Johann Casimir's lands in Thuringia and Franconia in 1613. By 1615, Gerhard had become general superintendent, which is the functional equivalent of a bishop, in Coburg, and had written a church ordinance, or a church order, which was the church ordinance, I'll go back here, the church ordinance of Johann Casimir. You can see it there in the German, which was later published in 1626. This church ordinance included chapters on many of the same topics that appeared in Gerhard's commonplace on the ecclesiastical ministry, such as the call, examination, ordination, investiture, which is installation, and pastoral duties. Of course, during his ministry, he had already started writing his theological commonplaces. A church ordinance in early Lutheranism was more and less than what we have in the LCMS handbook. It was more in that it usually included a detailed statement of faith to which all the ministers had to adhere. This was the body of doctrine part of the church ordinance. And you can see a good example of it at the beginning of the 1569 church ordinance written by Martin Chemnitz and Jakob Andrée and published as Church Order in the Chemnitz's Works series from CPH. In Gerhard's church ordinance, instead of a body of doctrine, he explains that God's word is the only rule of doctrine and preaching. He explains which ones are the symbolical books of our church, and he explains how the writings of the church fathers are to be regarded. Then Gerhard's church ordinance has chapters on the call, examination, ordination, investiture, preaching, catechization, ceremonies, confession and absolution, communion, baptism, marriage, visiting the sick, funerals, pastoral ethics, pastoral remuneration, duties of the laity, church and school visitation, the office of church superintendents, excommunication, church discipline, alms, lay leaders, hospitals, sacristans, and marriage cases. Then there's a Latin section dealing with school regulations. Why was it in Latin, do you think?
For school.
Because the school's language was Latin. It was like an international school. Gerhard was not original in all of this. He basically took two previously existing church ordinances and edited them for the situation at Coburg. Of these two church ordinances, the one that he quotes most often, both in his own church ordinance and in his theological commonplaces, is the 1580 church ordinance of Elector August of Saxony. And there's not a translation of this yet, is there? Not that I know of. In Lutheran Germany, following the first Saxon visitation of churches in 1527, a system of church polity soon developed which was centered around superintendents and consistories. In 1527, amid the visitation, it became clear to Luther and Melanchthon that the pastors and people would need continued supervision to deal with the large number of questions and problems that they had inherited from years of false doctrine and neglect. For this purpose, the government instituted superintendents to whom the pastors could turn. if they had questions or if they needed support. However, these superintendents often felt ill-equipped to deal with the confused legal matters, especially marriage cases. And therefore, the superintendents returned and referred difficult cases to the Visitation Commission, or even the Prince's Advisory Council, his Privy Council. That was quite unusual and strange for these cases were not really well suited for these kinds of commissions to deal with. Theologians such as Justus Jonas or Justice Jonas therefore recommended the formation of consistories to deal with such matters. A consistory in Latin was consistorium. In classical Rome, classical Latin, this meant the place where the emperor's council met, or the emperor's cabinet. It meant in Lutheran Germany that the consistory was going to be a board or a panel of theologians and lawyers appointed by the Christian magistrate, such as the Elector of Saxony, to deal with the oversight of the churches in the realm. So what we find with church governance in the old Lutheran system is that it is by no means democratic. You do not have democratic church government, but it's also not 100% pastor-led either. Rather, what you have is a mix of the leading laymen and the leading pastors that are governing the church. And that's generally the way they did it. So I refer to this as an aristocratic kind of church government, not in the sense of the aristocracy where the rich people and the nobility, but rather that you've got the best men, pastors and laymen, who are the ones that are governing the church, whether they are of the nobility or just educated, more common type people. So, in 1539, a consistory began its work in Wittenberg. It was similar to the combination of a board of directors and a board of adjudications. The cases that it decided dealt with marriage, disputes over church property, supervision of life, doctrine, and conduct of pastors, protecting pastors from injustice, and the exercise of the major ban, excommunication. This placement of church matters under consistories was widely adopted in all evangelical territories in Germany. At the Reformation, the churches of electoral Saxony were divided up among a number of different dioceses. You might remember that Luther sent the 95 Theses in 1517 to Albrecht of Mainz, his bishop. But Mainz was outside of electoral Saxony. So as the Reformation in Saxony proceeded and it was necessary to make changes, the Elector of Saxony with Luther and his Wittenberg team were not able to place any Lutherans into office as bishops, since the bishops of the churches over electoral Saxony had their cathedrals and residence outside of electoral Saxony. Therefore, the churches of electoral Saxony were reformed, ignoring the Roman Catholic bishops. And in the treatise on the power and primacy of the Pope, Melanchthon showed why it was legitimate for the Lutheran churches to call and ordain pastors without bishops. In 1541, however, there was an opportunity to put a Lutheran into office as a bishop. The little diocese of Naumburg was completely within the boundaries of electoral Saxony. Actually, not quite. It was a little bit more complicated than that. It actually was what was called a territory that was immediate to the empire, that is to say, directly under the emperor's jurisdiction, so essentially independent from the neighboring dukes. And it was governed by a bishop, so it was a prince-bishopric in this territory. However, it was small, and as the time had gone on in the late 1400s, this little prince-bishopric had become had come under the protection of the dukes of Saxony. And so there was this kind of unclear legal status as to who was really in charge, the prince-bishop or the Elector of Saxony. The Elector of Saxony, of course, thought he should be in charge, and so when the old bishop died in 1541, there was a new opportunity to put a Lutheran into office as a bishop. And in fact, he was going to be a prince bishop. It was kind of interesting. It was one of those few times when it seemed like it was going to work out. In a number of official opinions that will be published in Luther's Work 61 next year and that I've been working on, Luther, Melanchthon, Bugenhagen, and Caspar Cruciger gave advice to the Elector on how to go about reforming the Diocese of Naumburg into an evangelical Lutheran episcopacy. Let's see. Now, let me go back a little bit. So you see the arrow pointing to Little Naumburg there in 1541. It's the little white spot that's pointed to by the arrow. Okay. In 1542, Nikolaus von Amsdorf was elected by the estates of the territory, the estates of the diocese. And by that I mean the knights and the city councils of Naumburg and Zeitz, these two towns that were in that diocese. They essentially ignored the cathedral chapter. The cathedral chapter, where the nobility and I don't exactly know how to describe it simply, but a cathedral chapter was like this board or this council, and they had liturgical duties, so they would pray the Liturgy of the Hours in the cathedral on a regular basis. They would participate in Mass, and they also, if there was a vacancy in the diocese, then they would be the ones who would get to elect the next bishop. Well, most of those guys were Roman Catholic, and they were not going to elect a Lutheran as the next bishop. And so essentially what Luther and the Elector did is they said, well, we're just going to ignore the cathedral chapter, and we're going to have the city councils and the knights, together with the pastors, the Lutheran pastors that are already there, they're going to make the election. So they elected Nicholas von Amsdorf. He was the only nomination put forward by the Elector of Saxony. And then there was a consecration service for the new bishop, and the consecration was exactly like the ordination of a pastor. It essentially was like a second ordination to a different office, that of bishop. And the only difference in the ceremony from an ordination service is that at the end, there was an enthronement ceremony where the new bishop was led to his episcopal throne and sat down upon it, and then they were singing the Te Deum, and the Duke and the Elector went up to him and greeted him and gave him, wished him God's blessings. So that was like one additional ceremony that they added to the ordination of a pastor, and that's how they consecrated a bishop. And it was interesting also, the people that did the ordination were Luther and three superintendents, so three Lutheran superintendents, and then the Lutheran abbot of a monastery that was right there in this diocese. So this abbot, I forget his name, Thomas Habenstreit or something like that, he had been converted to Luther's doctrine in the 1520s and had been able to teach and convince most of the monks to become Lutheran. But instead of leaving the monastery, most of them stayed. And they essentially started as kind of their ministry, running a school and kind of having a school. And also just traditionally, the abbot of this monastery was the supervisor or the superintendent of several rural parishes. So he was considered to be also a bishop in that sense, in that he was a superintendent of parishes. So they had those four guys and Luther that did the ordination of Amsdorf as being the Bishop of Naumburg. It's really interesting. You'll get to read all about it next year when it comes out. So Luther also wrote a book called Model of How to Consecrate a True Christian Bishop, and that'll be in Luther's Work 61 too. Now, this Lutheran episcopate in Naumburg was really only a temporary episode. There was a lot of problems there in Naumburg. Amsdorf had problems because there was not clear lines of authority. Before he was installed as bishop, the Elector of Saxony already had like a secular governor that he had put into into place there in Naumburg and Zeitz. So he was already kind of handling the civil administration. And they already had a Lutheran superintendent of churches there, and he was already handling the actual episcopal functions. So what does Amsdorf do? And so he's in there in kind of a weird situation. And he was resisted all the time by the cathedral chapter. And then in 1546, Luther dies, the Schmalkald Wars happen, and in 1546 or 47, he's essentially forced out. And so he and 200 men and noblemen leave Naumburg and they go to Gotha. And so after that it became Roman Catholic again. But the good thing is that it never actually returned to being Roman Catholic. Whenever the Catholic bishop came in and took possession of it again, just about all of the priests were married, except for maybe one. And even the old believers, like the Roman Catholics, they were not in favor of abolishing Lutheran worship. They kind of liked how the Lutheran worship was going, and they didn't want it to be abolished. So, and then after that bishop died, then August of Saxony, the Elector of Saxony at the time, took management of it, and it returned to being a Lutheran territory. It never became Catholic again. Okay, anyway. It's interesting because in most places, Nicholas von Amsdorf was a nobleman. And because he was a nobleman, it was seen as fitting for him to be a prince bishop. And if you think about how the Lutherans were used to things in Germany, all of the bishops were noblemen. They all were. Okay? And most of them acted like secular princes. They didn't actually do much of their pastoral duty. So the Lutherans at Luther's time were very used to having noblemen essentially as the governors of the church. So it really wasn't that big of a difference. It wasn't that much of a change when the Elector of Saxony and the other princes became emergency bishops. And it actually was an improvement of things because at least they were being honest. That instead of having a bishop who's not really a bishop, but is a nobleman and a politician governing the church, now we actually have a pious Christian who is a layman and a nobleman as the chief emergency bishop. And now we actually have real pastors that are doing the hands-on, day-to-day pastoral care and governing of the church. So it's kind of interesting. It also shows that this model of superintendent and consistory is actually, it looks to me, very, very similar to the old model of bishop with cathedral chapter. That was the old model of governing. Not that a bishop would get to do anything that he wanted, but that it was bishop and cathedral chapter that did things in concert. And that's what you have with the superintendents and consistories among the Lutherans in Germany. Okay. Gerhard regarded the office of a church superintendent to be, in fact, the office of a bishop in a biblical sense. In On the Ministry, Part 2, paragraph 231, he writes, "The word bishops, episkopi, is taken from episkopein in Greek, which means to oversee, according to the interpretation of Augustine. Therefore, a bishop, episcopus, to the Latins is the same thing as an inspector, or as we say in the church today, a superintendent. Ambrose translates it as superinspector, Jerome as superintendens, superintendent. So they were actually picking up with their superintendent phraseology on patristic translations for the word episcopus in Greek. But they had to avoid the word episcopus in Latin because that had specific legal meanings. So in the Holy Roman Empire, bishops had certain civil powers. And that's not what the Lutheran men in the Holy Roman Empire had, even though they were carrying out the ministry and the office of the oversight of churches, which is what the Lutherans meant when they talked about a bishop. So it's interesting, and I really disagree with people that say that the Lutheran Reformation got rid of bishops. It's just not true. They reformed it and kept the biblical substance of it while stripping it of the secular aspects of it that they had in the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, and he goes on and says, in the holy writings of the New Testament, the word bishop is assigned in general to all who perform the teaching office in the church. For since they, quote, have been placed as bishop by the Holy Spirit to feed the church of God, Acts 20:28, and since they are commanded to, quote, feed the flock that is in their charge, exercising oversight, episkopuntes, 1 Peter 5:2, therefore they are rightly and deservedly called bishops because of this overseeing of the flock entrusted to them. However, to nurture good order and concord in the church, there formerly was established the sort of distinction among those pastors that some were entrusted not only with oversight over the flock entrusted to them, but also over other pastors and presbyters. As a result, it happened that the title bishop was attributed in a specific sense to those pastors who had the oversight over other teachers. Again, in responding to the charge that Lutherans held to the Arian heresy, that's A-E-R-I-A-N, the Arian heresy, which taught that there's no difference between bishop and presbyter, or priest, pastor, Gerhard says, none of us says there is no difference between bishop and presbyter. Instead, we acknowledge that in order to encourage ecclesiastical good order and harmony, it is useful to preserve the distinction between bishops and presbyters in the church. Gregorius de Valentia, a Roman Catholic, acknowledges that we establish such a separation. He writes, all Protestants admit at least 3 grades of ministers, namely bishops, whom they call superintendents, as having the care of church discipline, presbyters, whom they call ministers of the word and sacraments, and deacons, who diligently assist superintendents and pastors in the administration of the sacraments and in other duties. Bellarmine himself writes, Bellarmine is a Jesuit, Chemnitz teaches that there are only 3 true orders, bishops, whom they gladly call pastors, presbyters, whom they call elders or teachers or ministers of the word, and deacons. So the presbyter was not a lay office. When they talk about elders, they're not talking there about a lay office of a lay leader. And then Gerhard concludes, yet if we distinguish the order of bishops from presbyters, we are surely saying that there is some difference between bishop and presbyter. Now, this does not mean that Gerhard viewed bishops in the same way as his Roman Catholic opponents did. You can see that great difference between the two views, not only in the book On the Ministry, but also in the book On the Church, where Gerhard disproves the Roman Catholic doctrine of an unbroken succession of bishops stretching from Peter to his own day. And it's really a fun thing to read. Nevertheless, Gerhard holds that Lutherans at his day did hold to episcopacy, even in Germany where they were not called bishops. The word superintendent was used to focus on the oversight of doctrine, perhaps also to avoid the legal meanings of the word bishop in Germany. Thoughts or comments so far?
So, when did the German Landeskirchen go back to using it's like 100 years ago you had the Landesbischof, so like in Hanover and I think Bavaria. So when did they become comfortable again with using that term?
My sense is there's a process sometime in the 1800s into the 20th century. Essentially what they had to do first is the Holy Roman Empire had to come to an end with Napoleon. And then after that happened, there was democracy was becoming more popular in Germany as it was already in America and France. And so there was much more of a move to not have the princes essentially controlling the church, but to set up some kind of a synodical governance. And so really the synodical governance, where the pastors and lay representatives get together to decide the business of the church, has its roots in Germany in the early part of the 1800s. And there's differing, I mean, it was a chaos for a while. Different people had different ideas of what should be done. Some people were like, we should be totally democratic. Others would be like, no, restore the monarchy and restore the prince as the head of the church and things like that. So it was a big debate at the time. But by the end of the 1800s, it was pretty clear that the secular government is not going to be calling the shots over the church anymore, and the church is going to be more self-governing. And usually that's by means of synods. And synod meaning a synodical meeting, a gathering. So really when the Missouri Synod came over and they're doing some of the same thing here, they're not inventing anything de novo. They're taking what they knew. Yeah.
How would you compare the office of bishop with our Missouri Synod district presidents?
Well, we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that, and you're going to see exactly what their duties were, and it's very interesting, and you'll be able to see exactly what the difference is. Yes?
When you said on the previous slide, I think it was Gerhard writing on the ministry that, or Bellarmine when he's talking about it, that the Lutherans recognize these three grades of, when he says that they recognize, do we recognize these things de jure humano?
Yes. Yeah. De jure humano, so by human law. And also I want to explain what they meant also a little bit here. So for the Lutherans, they thought bishop equals our superintendent, presbyter equals our Pfarrer or senior pastor, and deacon would equal our assistant pastor or prediger or kaplan, so preacher or chaplain or minister of the word. So the Lutherans really, back in those days, made a big distinction between the head pastor of a parish, and that parish could have several preaching stations or filial churches, so to speak, with it. So like the parish rector is how it's actually a good translation for that, and they're thinking in legal terms, but de jure humano, they thought that guy has significant differences in duties than the assistant pastors. Now, they all have the administration of the Lord's Supper and baptism and the Word, but when it comes to things like discipline, then the parish pastor, the parish rector, the senior pastor of the parish, is going to, that's really where the buck stops, right there. And then we're going to see how that fits into a more superintendent kind of diocese model.
Was that mainly geographic, I assume?
Yeah.
Quite obviously. We have some congregations that are that have some sort of satellite strategy today, which is not mainly geographic. So it wouldn't be the same sort of necessity.
No, and back in those days it was geographic. Like the parish church in Wittenberg had a couple, like a filial church in like the little dorfs, the little villages outside of Wittenberg. And so the pastor, Bugenhagen, was the parish extended not just the city of Wittenberg, but also just these little nearby villages. And so the nearby village would have maybe a chaplain, that would be his title. And another one would have maybe a dean or a provost or something like that. You know, they have all these different titles, but essentially they would be underneath the authority of Bugenhagen as the parish rector for that parish. It was similar to like how my dad was pastor in Maryville, Missouri for a long time. It's northwest Missouri. There's really not that many Lutherans around that area. And they started a preaching station out in a place called Mound City. And so it wasn't really a congregation out there. It was a preaching station. They had members out there, and they were hoping that they would become eventually their own congregation. But he was essentially the parish rector both of Maryville and Mound City. And that's kind of the way it was. Yeah. So the call process. The call process in Gerhardt's district, Coburg, was handled mainly by the consistory and the superintendent. Candidates were not permitted to request a particular parish, much less to give bribes to obtain it. Now it's interesting, that's a good thing. The fact that this prohibition had to be there must have meant that it was actually something that people were trying to do. It was a problem or a danger. It may have happened. If a pastor was suffering poverty or other troubles, he should tell the consistory, the ordinary visitors, or his superintendent. And they, along with the patron of the parish, would then look into a translocation, a move. The patron of the parish was often a nobleman whose ancestors had put up the money to build the church or endow the parish pastor's salary. And the patron had a lot of rights within the parish, whereas the other people had basically no rights. So that's the way it was. And that's the system that came out of the Middle Ages, and that the Lutherans really didn't change until, again, into the 1800s. Now, the call process itself ran something like this. Those who have the right of patronage in a vacant parish should nominate suitable persons to the consistory. This has to happen so that the consistory can examine the candidate in person before he gives a trial sermon before the patron, and perhaps also before the congregation. If the candidates are found qualified, pure doctrine and upright life, testified by references, then they are presented to the congregation. The congregation then has the right to refuse a proposed new pastor, but they have to give reasons. If the reasons are trivial, from misunderstanding or ignorance, their refusal can be overruled by the consistory. In this case, the congregation would be instructed by the superintendent before the new pastor begins. Now, why would the congregation's wishes not be followed in this case? Gerhard explains, because it is not edifying to let a congregation continue in error, ignorance, or obstinacy.
You said edifying? Is that right?
It is not edifying, not edifying to let a congregation continue in error, ignorance, or obstinacy. Theology students, or SEM grads we might say, are not allowed normally to take over a pastorate right away. First, they must serve as school teachers or, quote, in the diaconate, we would say, as an assistant pastor. This is so that he can learn the rituals of the church. As a deacon, he would preach, give instruction, and visit the sick. With testimonies from his superintendents and pastor, he could later be called to a parish pastorate. Yet before the call to the parish pastorate, he would need to be examined again. This examination consisted of a trial sermon and an inspection of his progress in learning and reading, or his lack thereof. The consistory carries out this examination and keeps records in a book of men waiting for a call. A particularly gifted man, equipped for preaching and well acquainted with the rituals of the church, may skip the diaconate period. The decision on this lies with the consistory. Not only was this examination required before the first call, it was also required before subsequent calls to other parishes. So you would continuously get TIs throughout your career. There was a specified list of points that the consistory had to examine. It wasn't just left up to them to decide on their own what to examine. Is his doctrine pure? Is he diligent in studying Scripture and reading other books? What kind of a voice does he have? What is his health status? Does he lead a morally upright life? How old is he? And has he subscribed the Book of Concord? The trial sermon was also necessary, a trial sermon. Here the consistory would pick a text, and the man being examined would have to give a short sermon on it. Essentially, he'd have just a little bit of time to come up with what he's going to say. Here's the text, take a couple hours, and then you're going to preach. The consistory then should pay attention not just to his oratory, but also to his pronunciation and gestures. If the examination is a failure, but the candidate is young and there is hope that he will improve, he should be sent back to school, to the academy, the university or whatever, for further study. Okay, so that was before the consistory. Then there is the trial sermon before the congregation. The superintendent presents the candidate to the congregation. The candidate preaches, and afterwards the superintendent asks the parishioners if they will have him. So you see from this that the common people as a whole did not have a choice between several candidates, as they do in a U.S. election. One candidate was put forward before them, and after listening to him, they could accept him or refuse him. You might be interested to learn that even to this day, in our sister church in Germany, the SELK, the Selbstständige Evangelisch-Lutherische Kirche, Independent Evangelical Lutheran Church, this is still essentially their process. Their call process, the church leadership or the church governance, which is also, again, it's a mixed group of pastors and lay leaders. They essentially propose a candidate to the congregation, and then the congregation says yes or no. So that's how they do it. Yeah.
Do you have a sense? It would be tough to get a sense, I suppose, but for what the congregation would be instructed to look for? Or was it just arbitrary? Do you like the guy? Does he look good?
Well, my guess is they would be instructed to, just like you would probably instruct somebody, does he preach the Word of God purely? Does he lead a morally upright life? The sort of things that are in our ordination rite.
It's just that that's tough to get from a sermon, one sermon. I mean, that wouldn't be the thing we would want to look to. We'd want to look to his body of work, his confession, his instruction.
Yeah, and that's the sort of thing that my sense is that the consistory and the superintendent would be essentially telling like giving good references to the congregation, saying he lives an upright life, he's Orthodox, he's subscribed to the Book of Concord, and now you're going to hear him preach for yourself, for yourselves, and then you can decide whether you want to have him.
We've got debates today about if trial sermons in our circles are helpful in this process, and they're becoming more common, but it would be helpful to know the reasoning behind that trial sermon, because it doesn't sound like it's doctrine. It sounds like that's already happened. It sounds like it's style, or did you like it? Did he tell stories, or?
That's a good question, but nevertheless, it was seen as a normal part that the congregation would get to hear the man that they're going to have as their preacher. So, sometimes it might happen that he gets up, he starts preaching, and maybe the doctrine's pure, but they can't understand anything he's saying. He mumbles all his words. And they might say, we're not going to have this guy. We can't understand what he's saying. And that would actually be a legitimate reason. So, yeah.
At what point did the pastor have the right to decline? Was that before he was invited to the congregation to do his song and dance?
It's a good question. I have not really looked into the issue of like translocations from one place to the other. Obviously, I do know that pastors of this time, when they would get a call to a different congregation, they would consider this and pray about this, take it very seriously, and sometimes ask for official opinions from pastors, circuits, even university faculties, things like that.
With regard to trial sermons, the manual for circuit visitors discourages it, and I think this is the basis. It's not really a procedural thing. It has to do with the pastor having to leave his own congregation to do the trial sermon, which indicates the congregation he's in that he's ready to go. And so I think that's the idea of this circuit visitors manual, saying, let's not do it that way.
Well, I know that a lot of times nowadays, I think in the early Missouri Synod, previously the idea was that all of our pastors ought to be interchangeable. And we shouldn't have people that are, saying, I want this guy because he looks good and he's got a good speaking voice or whatever.
Today, congregations, they zero in on the internet anyway, and they hear the sermons that way. So they already.
So nowadays, we're kind of getting trial sermons without this kind of procedure. And I guess what I see from that is, I think it's important that a congregation knows the man that they're going to have, and that they not be calling a guy and approving him without ever having known what he teaches or hearing how he teaches. I think that's important. Okay, Wes, we'll go 1, 2, 3, and then we're moving on. Okay.
How would a patron have known someone to recommend?
That's a good question. Probably the same way that congregations know about pastors to call, and that a friend of a friend said this is what they should do. Yeah. That's exactly how it happened.
While you're answering these questions, can you flip back one screen?
Sure.
There, thank you.
You mentioned that if a younger candidate failed the examination, he might be sent back to school. What about an older candidate?
Then that's it. He's not going to be a pastor. At least not there. He might try his luck some other region, some other ecclesiastical supervision area. We would say another district. He could try his luck in another district maybe, but he's not going to ever be a pastor in Saxony or whatever. Yeah.
In our day, the flow of money from the offering plate goes upwards with salary to the pastor, up to the district and synod, and sometimes skipping district, going straight to synod and so forth. What was the order in which money would flow in this kind of a system?
That's kind of an important question. I only know a little bit about it. The people's offerings didn't make much of a difference. The churches were not generally supported by the people's offerings. People were supposed to offer, and it was important that they did. But a lot of times the church, like the pastor's salaries and such, were paid for directly by the government. So, like at the time of the Reformation, instead of the church, like the Roman Catholic Church, paying the salaries, the Elector of Saxony had to start taking care of this stuff. And they were trying to figure this out during Luther's time. And part of the reason why a lot of ecclesiastical property was secularized and the possessions were taken by the ecclesiastical princes, not the ecclesiastical princes, by the territorial princes, is so that they would have property from which they would get revenue to be able to pay pastors' salaries. And that's essentially a lot of times what Luther recommends, is that the various wealth of the Roman Catholic Church would be confiscated, and from that you would have property that would generate income, like rental income, that would then pay for the pastor's salaries. So I think that either direct princely support or like rental incomes off of real estate was very common as a funding model back in these days. Yeah. And but as time goes on, the people, middle classes, gain wealth, and then by the 19th century, you're actually able to have congregations that are able to support their own pastors. After the candidate has been cleared by the consistory and accepted by the laity, he still had to get the confirmation by the prince in Coburg. So off to Coburg the candidate would go, and there he would preach yet another trial sermon. After being given the okay by the prince, ordination and/or installation would follow. Gerhard's church ordinance stated also that repeated examination was required for preachers who had been serving less than 8 years, even though they had already been ordained. This would have to take place if their progress in study was not already known by the consistory. So there was a lot more checks, and not just trusting that, he's a seminary graduate, he's going to be fine, but making sure that he continues in his study. That's why I bring this up, and this is part of the study day, to show how they enforced continuing education. Yeah.
How much of the way that our seminaries are set up right now, generally speaking, is determined by accreditation requirements? Or how much? Yeah, okay. I mean, if we wanted to do some of this kind of stuff, we probably wouldn't be able to. We'd lose our accreditation.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, who knows what can be done? Sometimes I think the accreditation agencies can be more flexible, but it's difficult because this is what we're all used to. And once you're used to something, it's difficult to change it. But there's definitely, I think, we're coming to a time when we've got to start thinking through things and thinking about whether there's other models. One of the things that I like about this in that it's a variable time of education, recognizing that some guys come to seminary already knowing a whole lot, and it wouldn't take them necessarily a full 3 years to be able to, 3 years of study plus vicarage to become a pastor, potentially. And others, it's going to take longer. And I don't know. There's things we need to continue to think about, especially as we get go into the future with changing demographics and changing technology. So what can we learn from this call process? We can learn that there was a lot of preaching involved. They took the ability to preach well very seriously. The consistory was like a board of directors combined with a board of adjudication for a district the size of maybe 4 circuits. Our district presidents would be equivalent to superintendents. There was a lot more checks and balances, or rather checks and controls on the purity of doctrine. There was also a clear program of continuing education and recertification. They did not have to take classes. They did not have to come to CE classes. But each pastor had to do it, had to do continuing education and demonstrate progress in his theological study. I also found it interesting that I did not see any particular requirements for an academic degree before becoming a pastor. It didn't matter what degree you had, it mattered what you knew and what kind of a person you were. I think that's important too. Yeah.
Do we have sermons and any evidence of how the parish pastor, how good his preaching was? Or do we only have surviving sermons of, important people like Johann Gerhard?
I'm sure there are manuscripts written. I don't know how often pastors at this time actually would write out their sermons. My guess is that they probably most often did not. Probably most often would preach from notes. But I'm sure there are manuscripts where you could go back into archives and look and see what it was like. All right, let's take 5 minutes, and really not much more than that. Just